Some years ago, a delegation of teachers from Florida took a trip to Russia to meet their counterparts and exchange information and ideas with the Russian teachers. They reported later that what the Russians really wanted to hear from them was guidance on how to set up and manage democratic schools. They asked that based on the premise that since this was the United States, a country committed to the idea of democracy, remember this is some years ago, surely children from their earliest years must be involved in substantial decision-making in schools. The irony even then was enough to make you wince. Now, of course, the whole idea, the whole conversation takes on another implication entirely, given that in the year 2025, the U.S. is being governed by people who are actively involved in trying to dismantle democracy. That's why I made a point of talking with Joel Westheimer, who holds the University Research Chair in Democracy and Education at the University of Ottawa. Joel was born and raised in the U.S., but he's become something of a public intellectual in Canada, regularly holding forth on the radio about issues in education, including standardized testing, ed tech, and so on. But mostly he speaks, writes, and does his research in the areas of citizenship and democracy. His books include What Kind of Citizen?, which Teachers College Press released in 2024 in a second edition. A chance to talk about democracy and education with an expert, Joel Westheimer. I'm Alfie Kohn, and this is Kohn Zone. Joel, thanks so much for coming on board here to talk about this during these dire days when democracy is more timely than ever, if only because of its dwindling presence in our society.
It's a pleasure to be here, Alfie.
You noted at some point that young people today seem to have less commitment to democracy, less of a sense that this is something we care about enough to want to maintain and retain. But then you said something about being sympathetic to them, and that you said, who could blame them? Why do you say that?
Yeah, young people, first of all, of course, are more distant than you and I from, or at least used to be, from living in a fascism era or even adjacent to fascism. We have direct memories, in my case, my family, my parents both went through the Holocaust. So one thing is that they don't, fear the alternative as much. Now, maybe that will change very soon. But the reason I say, who could blame them is that within the context of not comparing it to something like totalitarian fascism, democracy hasn't been delivering on the issues that they find important. During the time that they've been, coming of political age, they've seen gun control legislation, for example, background checks, which 97% of the American population after shootings support, and even, of course, bigger legislation, nothing's happened. And they've seen general gridlock in the legislature. They've seen a kind of politics that has debased politics in general. Other issues that are important to them, climate change, housing, it hasn't delivered. And so they're dissatisfied.
But is it democracy that hasn't delivered? Or is it the political system that maybe is less democratic?
Yeah. What do you mean by the political system versus democracy?
Well, I guess I'll turn the question back to you. How are you defining democracy? Are you saying it, using the term so it's coextensive with our entire political process, with the way the legislature works, with the impact of big money on decision making and so on? Is that all go under the rubric of democracy, or is democracy something that's at risk because of other choices and systemic structures?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think in the minds of young people, because this is the manifestation of democracy that they've seen most of their adult life, those two are equated. If you're asking me, I would say democracy is the principles and the ideals of which our government is structured around and runs. But of course, we've seen more and more flaws in that system because I think most of us didn't realize how much of it is dependent on norms. And so we have a president and an entire party that couldn't care less about those norms. And so the very principles of democracy are impacted and fall apart.
So we'll get into the nitty-gritty later, but just from a big picture perspective, what is the prescription to teach them differently about democracy or to do democracy better so they can see it being done correctly? Or what's your RX here?
So, of course, you and I are in the field of education. I think there are many levers that we can use to improve democracy and improve commitments to democracy. But, my hammer is education, and that's what I think about. And I do think that education has a huge role to play in a number of ways. Some of which are, supported by many people, some of which are a little less obvious. Of course, we need to teach kids about democracy. Here where I'm living right now in Ontario, we have a grade 10 civics class, and we're doing research right now on youth's perceptions of democracy. And the civics class is atrocious. It's kind of falls into the death by civics category. None of them remember anything from civics. It's paired with careers as if what career you have is the exact same thing as what kind of citizen you're going to be. And it's taught by gym teachers and community members. It's a disaster, right? And that's true for some places in the U.S. as well. And so even the teaching about democracy is not great. But I like to make the distinction of, when people say democratic education, they're talking about at least three things. There are probably more, but one is teaching about democracy, like I was just talking about. The second is teaching for democracy, which means preparing kids to be active participants and engaged in democratic life. And the third is teaching democratically, which overlaps possibly with the second one, but is a different thing. You can use democratic teaching as a gimmick.
The conservatives are very big on civics education. They clearly mean only, at best, the first of those three options.
And only a selective view of the first, right? Eliminating certain aspects of history, et cetera.
Yeah, well, that's increasingly true as well. But I found that they seem to toggle between, on the one hand, a kind of mandatory patriotism, and on the other hand, what you're calling death by civics, where you just have to memorize the three branches of government and what the Electoral College does in the U.S. and so on. But it's interesting that the right-wing groups like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is funded by the Koch brothers, wants legislation to make a high school diploma contingent on passing a multiple-choice test of civics facts. And several Republican states have passed just such legislation. So is there any value to that at all, or is the problem that they just want to teach facts as opposed to skills? Or is there a third alternative, which is not just facts or skills, but a disposition or desire to be active participants in a democracy?
Yeah, I think that I'm not against facts. Facts provide a scaffolding for the way people learn other facts and other processes. The problem is when the pursuit of facts entirely displace the goals that those facts are to be put in the service of.
Yeah.
And then kids lose interest, right? So in some ways, in some kinds of pedagogy, you want to have the ideals and the goals and the philosophical discussions first, and the facts will follow because people need the facts to have those discussions. In other cases, you could do some facts first, but you have to do it in an engaging way, and certainly not in a way where it displaces the other goals.
Okay. Do you mean the same thing by civics or education as by citizenship education, and or how does character education fit into that? What's your schema here? How do these terms differ?
Civics education has been taken now to mean the pursuit of facts to many people. I would like to equate civics education with citizenship education, but I don't think that's possible anymore until we sort of wrestle the term back from the forces that want the first kind. Citizenship education opens up a whole panoply of underlying ideologies and values that education is in the pursuit of, some of which certain people support and some of which other people don't support. You mentioned character education. Can I talk about that for a minute?
Yeah.
Character education, for those of your listeners who don't know, tend to pursue certain what they often call pillars or values, and so you'll often know a school has character education because they'll have a poster or something on the wall that has the pillars of values. Monday is honesty, and Tuesday is integrity, and Wednesday you don't need honesty anymore because that was Monday. Things like that. Those values, devoid of talking about the different ways society can be organized, are useless, right? They're about training obedience, taking away critical thinking, and so I see them as counterthetical, most of them, to democratic learning. It's not that we disagree with all of them. I mean, you want people to be generally honest and good people, and help their neighbors and things. They're just insufficient. And some of them are in conflict with education for democracy. So, for example, one of the most popular pillars is loyalty. And loyalty in the right context can be okay, but loyalty when you're talking about government sounds dangerous to me.
I mean, one could offer a critique of character education for emphasizing obedience over deeper, more ambitious values. Just talking about individuals and their relationship to other individuals. But you're adding another aspect to the critique. It's not just the orientation of character ed in its own, but what it means to have, presumably, correct me if I'm wrong about what you're saying here, Joel, that even a better, deeper, undangerous approach to character education doesn't suffice unless you put it in the context of the society and the politics that we live in. Is that right?
Exactly. And an interesting second thing, I mean, you wrote a fantastic piece on character education that takes in some of these ideas we're talking about. But in addition to what we're talking about, it's terrible pedagogy, right? That's why I call it death by civics. I mean, even if you are taking away the values and what it pursues, it's awful pedagogy because it's just sort of memorizing these pillars and it's just a bad way of teaching.
Right. You offer a nice schema that doesn't overlap exactly with the three versions that you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, where in your book, What Kind of Citizen, you talk about, on the first level, a personally responsible person, person who does her part, obeys the laws, volunteers, recycles, and so on. Second, being someone who participates, is actively involved in community efforts, maybe even organizes them. And then the third level is a social justice-oriented citizen who looks at root causes, questions the power dynamics, works on the system change, right? Did I get that right?
Yeah, and just to give an example to articulate what you just laid out, those three kinds, if the participatory citizens, the one that emphasizes participation
The
are
middle one.
organizing a food drive, for example.
Yeah.
The personally responsible citizens are donating cans of food because they're nice
Right.
people. And the social justice-oriented citizens might be asking, how come in one of the richest countries in the world we have people who are hungry? And I'll say one other thing about those three kinds of citizens. The second two that you mentioned that we lay out, Joe Kohn and I in the original study, participation and questioning root causes of problems, critical thinking, those have a lot to do with democracy. Right? That's what democracy requires of citizens. Questioning, dissent. Dissent is the engine of progress in democratic societies. We want people to participate, of course, to be involved in community affairs and national affairs. They have a lot to do with democracy or democratic citizenship. But that first one you described and we describe, sort of aligned with character education, that has absolutely nothing to do with democratic citizenship. They're universal. There's not a country in the world that doesn't want its citizens to pay taxes or show up to work on time or help an old person across the street or not to litter and not to do drugs, right? Any totalitarian regime wants that of their citizens, especially loyalty. So it might be what some would call a good citizen, but it has nothing to do with being a good democratic citizen.
Right. So, but the third one, the one that has to do with questioning the power dynamics and not just contributing to the food drive, but asking questions about systemic causes of hunger, that sounds a lot to me like what I think of as liberal left politics, and sometimes radical left politics, because liberals often don't ask those deeper systemic questions. So to what extent are you offering something that you want people to be able to endorse regardless of their politics? And to what extent are you saying, no, if you're going to think deeply about democracy, then we have to offer a kind of citizenship education that is leftist?
Yeah. And so it raises the, what George Counts called the boogeyman of indoctrination, right?
Right.
And so, first of all, this was a long time ago that we came up with those three kinds of citizens. There's been a lot of research by ourselves and others now using that framework. I might find a different name for social justice, because social justice signals to people on the right a lefty kind of politics, right?
Yeah, but it's not just about the name, right?
No, it's not. But let me just reframe the name for a second. To me, social justice is made up of two words: social, which means of society, and justice, which means fairness, right? So fairness within society. That seems like a less provocative framing of social justice, just because the words have been tainted. But let me get to the substance of what you asked, because it's good. I think that if I'm careless and flippant, or if other people are, about the use of the term social justice, it could move into territory where what we're talking about is our values or ways of seeing government that are associated with more progressive thought. On the other hand, there are attributes of good democratic citizens that are consistent with democratic life. Democratic life requires critical thinking, for example, because, look, in a totalitarian regime, no leader wants people to ask questions. They just make decisions and hand down the rules as they are, and it's not for the citizenry to ask questions. In former totalitarian regimes, there's not even voting. Now, countries like that have the shell of voting, but it's not real. But democracies require something different of their citizens. They require people to engage with those values, engage with critically thinking about the rules that we have and wondering if we should improve them by creating different rules. I don't see that as associated with progressive ideas. I see it as associated with democratic ideas. And anyone who really believes in democratic life should embrace those characteristics.
So if the right comes after you for left ideas. It's in a way an example of telling on themselves about the extent to which the conservatism they embrace is not really committed to democracy, as most of us would talk about it, right? It's sort of like when Fox News ran this show. I don't know if you saw this, but they had a photo of, get rid of fascism as graffiti on a wall. And they talked about anti-Trump messaging. They're sort of giving it away here. Hey, we didn't say Trump here is fascistic. You equated them. So it's sort of like a version of that, structurally speaking, maybe.
Yeah. And well, what's difficult when we talk about this work in schools is that I think we used to be able to use the word democracy as kind of a touchstone of something that you weren't allowed to disagree with, right? If you, everyone wanted society to be democratic. And so that was untouchable. What was, touchable is what that means exactly, blah, blah, blah. That's changed, right? What we're witnessing right now. No, people are unabashed about saying the president should have power without having to have interference from legislators or the courts. They're basically embracing fascism, and they might not say it by word, but they say it by everything else. So that's changed.
Starting with the right-wing intellectuals who like to patronizingly inform us that it's not a democracy, it's a republic, as if this is historically meaningful in any way. It's just another way of actually taking a step back from democracy. So when you talk about the three basic approaches, again, personally responsible, participatory, and social justice oriented, and now I'm going to ask you to think prescriptively what you think schools ought to be doing, not empirically about what they are doing. What differences, if any, emerge depending on the age of the kids? What should the program, what should the instruction look like for elementary versus middle or high school?
We're often asked whether this is a developmental model, right? So, little kids in elementary school should learn about being personally responsible. And then, middle school kids can start to learn about participating in their community, and high school kids can learn about asking difficult questions because they're mature enough to handle it. I don't see it that way. If we think we're both parents, and if we think of one of the mantras of childhood when kids are little, and I'm sure a lot of parents will this will resonate with them. Right. What do kids say all the time? It's not fair. It's not fair, right? And if that's not an entry point to talking about justice or what's fair, I don't know what is. And in fact, it's young kids who often ask difficult questions. When I grew up in New York City, and that's where I spent a lot of my adult life, and we had my daughter there. And, if we walked by a homeless person in the street, I was kind of numb to it, of course. I've seen it my whole life. My daughter asked a million questions. Why is this person on the street? They might not have a job. Why don't they have a job? Why aren't they paid enough to have a home? If we bring up mental health issues, they say, why don't they get, why do they have mental health issues? So all these questions have to do with justice. So I think that we need to be teaching all three in some sense along the way. You asked me about the prescriptions in general, but this is very interesting, and I want to talk with you about what's changed. In general, I liked to think about the fact that schools, and this is a critique of schools that so many people have done since the beginning of education, is that schools don't teach kids to ask questions, right? They teach kids to obey the rules. Part of obeying the rules is socializing kids, and that's important. But again, like we said before, if we don't teach kids to ask questions, to be critical thinkers, we have an impoverished democracy, or democracy only in name. The reason I say that this is interesting and is worth talking about a little more is because the right has kind of co-opted this notion, and when I say the right, in this case, I'm just talking about people who are not interested in these democratic values. I don't mean the entire right wing of the party, but they've kind of co-opted that language of critical thinking, right?
Yep.
Is it are kids thinking critically if they think that there's a pedophile ring happening under a pizza shop? Well, people have told them that there isn't, so let's think critically and say that there is, right? They divorce it from argument and evidence, but they call it critical thinking.
They're the real skeptics. They do their own research.
Exactly. So that's made it problematic. And I don't know. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but it's a conundrum.
Yeah, it is indeed. In fact, I wrote a whole essay on skepticism and reclaiming the concept, and it is something that certainly challenges all of us to think about it, because you can't just say, no, you're supposed to be skeptical about this, not about that. You have to come up with some larger schema to understand why they're misusing the term, if indeed they are, and what it is you're trying to promote.
Exactly. I think that's exactly right.
But in any case, you run up against this notion of the problems. Well, you talked about, what did you say, the boogeyman of what?
The boogeyman of indoctrination. The funny thing is George counts when he used that term. I only selected part of the quote. The full sentence is, the boogeyman of indoctrination does not scare me. In other words, he was all for indoctrination and he didn't mind the word.
Well, how do we avoid this? How to avoid indoctrination, given that pure objectivity or neutrality is an illusion, it's self-deception? How do you teach open-mindedness without falling into the trap of relativism, but truly doing something that people who disagree with you on political particulars would not accuse you of trying to do indoctrination? Maybe it scares you, even if it doesn't scare George Counts.
Absolutely. I think there's not that many people who talk about democratic values who want to push one particular and only one particular way of looking at the world on students without the students thinking about it, at least the good people who are doing this work. And yes, and as you said, being in neutrality is an illusion, right? We always have values underlying education, and not teaching any values is teaching the values that we currently have without any critical thought put to it. I think that it's not difficult to both embrace. Another characteristic of democracy is dealing with multiple perspectives, and so within reason, multiple perspectives, using argument and evidence for those perspectives. And that should be a goal, right? That kids have to be able to talk across difference. We see this immense polarization right now, and we have to fight against that. It's school's job to bring in multiple perspectives and teach kids that. And can I say one approach to doing that is teaching kids that there are different values. It's pretty simple, right? Kids might come from homogenous communities, homogenous families. We're not teaching them to reject their families or their church or the values they've grown up with, but we are introducing them to the fact that well-meaning, adults differ on important matters of social concern. And you can do that in a number of ways pedagogically.
But multiple perspectives is one of those concepts, like skepticism or critical thinking, that seems to have been appropriated, if not co-opted, by folks who make us worried. We were giving equal time to creationism, so on. Or, it's not just a matter of let's have arguments for and against tariffs, but let's criticize the very concepts you're understanding as bedrock notions of. They want to criticize critical thinking itself. So is there like first order versus second order ideas where it's okay to have multiple perspectives and hear people out on both sides on one level, but there's other stuff that maybe the meta level concepts that inform this whole discussion where, no, we're not going to have people arguing against critical thinking.
Yeah, right. For or against, the Holocaust happened.
Or another example, right?
Right. I was nodding my head the whole time you were talking there, because I think that's exactly right, and that's why I kept using the phrase argument and evidence. You can't just say stuff. You have to talk about the logical steps that lead up to that perspectives, and in some cases, you have to talk about data. You can't throw anything out. The concept of fake news, has to be interrogated. Right now, I think that that's very difficult. It's very difficult because of where people are, because of the echo chambers that people live in. But I'm not willing to just throw out the idea of evidence and what we know from science. Science also has underlying values, and we should interrogate those. But that doesn't mean you throw out the baby with the bathwater. One thing that teachers can do that, I'm going to say the simplest of things that teachers can do. They can tell students that someone wrote the textbook, right? Students are like, what? I mean, the textbook is just, what was handed on from down high on 2 tablets or something. And the teacher can say, no, really, someone wrote the textbook. In fact, look in the textbook at the beginning or at the end, you'll see authors or a committee that put this textbook together. And the reason I say that that's a critical thinking question is because once students know that people actually wrote the textbook, you can ask questions like, why those people? What do they do in their other life, when they're not writing textbooks? What values do they stand for?
Right.
Who didn't write the textbook, right?
What biases, what errors, yeah.
Exactly. It raises questions that imply that there are many ways of looking at things. Amanda Anderson is a literary theorist that I learned about from my wife, who's a literature professor. And I read Amanda Anderson, and she says this question that I just love. She said, or statement, she said that she thinks literature is primarily concerned with the question, how should we live? And if you apply that to education, the question, how should we live, is a very provocative and important question because it implies that there are different ways to live and that we, including young people, have a say or need to make decisions about how we should live. It implies multiple perspectives that are very important.
Which contrasts rather sharply with teachers, of whom there are many, who talk about being good citizens and mean you sit there and raise your hand and wait to be called on and you follow the rules. That's fundamentally what it means.
Yeah.
I know a history teacher, by the way, high school history teacher, who taught the Salem witch trials by photocopying 4 different textbooks' treatment of it, so that they were able to not only get different views of that, but to be taken aback by the fact that if they had seen only one, each one, of course, they differed considerably, but each one was told in that corporate, hearty tone of absolute certitude.
Yeah, I love that.
Now they realize we can question our textbooks because multiple textbooks don't even agree with each other.
Yeah. And of course, that can go off the deep end, too. How do I know the Norman invasion was in 1066? There's some things that we have accepted as some kind of truth, even though I don't like using that word, but truth for now. And that's exactly right. And in the age of the internet, of course, we can get textbooks or information from all over the world in different countries as well. My kids largely grew up in Canada now. I grew up in the United States. I think I had maybe like 2 sentences or a paragraph on the War of 1812. My kids studied the War of 1812 for like a month. I mean, the United States and Canada can't even agree on who won the War of 1812. Right?
Well, and the North and the South in the U.S. can't agree on what the Civil War was about.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, I've spent decades without coming to an easy solution here with the larger issue of relativism and objectivity. let alone the particular applications in an education setting. So I was hoping you had something to hold on to that offers us a way out, to think about, here's a resolution to this where we can say to teachers, here's why it's okay to take this perspective, stick by it, not give equal time to the opposing view, to promote important democratic values, and then decide after the fact, either I've done it in a way clever enough so I'm not going to piss off the right wing, or I'm going to piss off the right wing and say that's okay.
Yeah, I do have some suggestions.
Oh, good. Oh, goody.
And first, I should say that there are programs in schools that are somewhat successful at bridging the polarized political space that we have now, that kids do come out with an appreciation of multiple perspectives. Just on the first part of what you said, I've used the phrase argument and evidence a couple of times. And I think that we do have to pay attention to where are you getting that idea from? Why do you say that? And is it a reasonable perspective? The other thing is looking historically. What were the results of certain perspectives, right? Black people are dumber than white people. What happens to society when you have that perspective? And so I think that helps too. But I want to say something a little different also. When we take this sort of pet teaching dilemma, we often think of like, how do we direct that how do we address that problem head on? I think that there's a value of doing adjacent work to that. And one thing that's tangential or adjacent to it is working on community, because we have people so quick now to bring discussions to a fever pitch, to just jump to you're an idiot for having that perspective, that we have to consider that. And one of the ways that I think we do that is by having real people, in this case, young people, interact with real people, other young people who have different perspectives, but not just talking about those perspectives, starting with building community in the classroom, building relationships so that they know this other person, right? That they would have a lot more trouble just dismissing this other person because they've had experiences with them. Teachers no longer, they don't have time to build that kind of community because the insane emphasis on coverage and that everything needs to be done. And I think we need to bring that time back to establish at the beginning of the year strong relationships between students that will then, when we take up the actual topics that you and I are talking about now, it'll make that a lot easier.
And the subtext of teaching that way deals with the individualism of the society itself by offering implicitly a perspective that it's not just about me and him and her, it's about us.
Yeah. And you know what works against us, of course, if we just move beyond schools for a minute? The media has had 12 years to deal with what's going on in politics, to understand, well, how should they cover things where one perspective is not rooted in any kind of evidence that can be taken seriously. And they've failed. They've failed spectacularly because the media is drawn to on the one hand and on the other hand.
That's right.
And so they take perspectives, and I love this word that was coined, sane washing, right? Yeah. And they make things sound sane that simply don't deserve that moniker. And so the media has been enormously detrimental. And I'm not talking about Fox News. I'm talking about the media across the span, right?
Oh, the New York Times does this every single day. In fact, we've fallen just in our conversation today, we have slipped into talking about polarization. And that very framing suggests that there's two equally valid views that just need to come together.
Absolutely.
Which is a very, very different observation than we're under assault by fascists,
Yes, exactly. It's drawing false dichotomies, and the media is unable to escape from that framing, or have been so far.
Right. So in addition to your work on trying to figure out what kind of citizen and what schools, you also edited a collection a few years ago called Pledging Allegiance. So just very briefly before I get into more pedagogical stuff, I just wanted to ask you about this because it's related to the idea of, I guess, ultimate goals and the idea of neutrality and indoctrination and so on. And that deals with the very concept of patriotism. So the standard liberal line on patriotism is, I love my country when it's right, or I love the ideals behind what's supposed to be in the country, but a patriotic person is able to criticize the country when it's wrong, and so on. Let's call that the liberal view that says that patriotism includes and even requires some degree of dissent. The radical view is the view that patriotism, even in its dilute or liberalized form, is really problematic because nationalism inherently pulls people away from universal values of fairness and pulls us more toward loyalty and away from the value of every human life. So in your anthology, you had an essay by Robert Jensen, who also wrote a great piece right after 9/11 called Goodbye to Patriotism, which I always recommend to people, and something by the great Howard Zinn, Put Away the Flags, he wrote, where he said our allegiance should be to the human race. Elsewhere, he said also to the principles that underlie democracy. So where do you come out on this? Is it just a matter of a broader, squishy definition of patriotism that everybody can get behind? Or should we be critically interrogating the whole idea of patriotism?
Yeah. Such good questions, and I think both are right. And in fact, the full title of the book is Pledging Allegiance: The Politics of Patriotism in America's Classrooms. Mm-hmm. And it also followed 9/11, right? So yes, it was when there was this surge of patriotism in classrooms and in the broader society. The reason I say, look, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that patriotism is a very dangerous idea because blind allegiance to a country, to any group, without considering the position of others and other communities is clearly dangerous. Mm-hmm. And some of the worst moments in history have come out of that. On the other hand, dismissing the idea of patriotism, and I'm trying to channel now the people who find patriotism a useful concept, dismissing it outright might also be problematic because it denies the value of community to democracy, right? Patriotism certainly is at home in totalitarian regimes, but ideally, and in the book, I called this democratic patriotism. And I did that not easily because I'm very sympathetic with the idea that patriotism is not a great concept. But if we reclaim the idea of patriotism, I would like it to address the issue of fraying community, right? Diminishing community. All the stuff now on loneliness, right? There's an epidemic of loneliness. And patriotism, singing the same songs, like people do at camp, knowing some of the same cultural touchstones, feeling that your group is important, not the most important or not to the exclusion of other groups, but that our ties mean something, I think shouldn't be easily dismissed. When that book came out, I got a lot of letters and people contacting me, and a lot of them were from veterans. And the veterans said that their time in the military was the best time of their lives, the most important and formative time in their lives, because I had bonds to one another that were stronger than anything I've had ever since. And that's speaking to the importance of community. And, I'd like to say, okay, well, just so you know, we can create those bonds around building bridges instead of blowing them up. But we want those other possibilities of coming together in society. But these were very heartfelt letters about how valuable that time was to them.
Yes, and certainly I've heard professional athletes talk about everything they think they got from being in an activity where they had to obey their coach, and the goal was to defeat other people who were trying to defeat them. But when you look at it critically, you can then ask questions about, well, what aspects did you get out of this that were positive? A, were they really entirely positive? Or are they morally problematic? And B, could you get them without the bad stuff? So with respect to the idea of community that you've raised, I suppose one question is, are you sure you're talking about community in the case of patriotism, or are you playing games with the concepts here? Buber talked about the difference between a community and a collective, and he was not fond of the latter, and patriotism seems more like the latter. And then the second question you could ask is, what level of community? Yeah, we want people to feel part of an us as long as it's not us against them. But do we really need to, or should we be doing it at the level of a nation state? Mm-hmm. And if not, then we can get community and completely repudiate patriotism, which by definition is about nation states. Or have I missed something here?
No, I don't think you have. That's the problem. And in the book, I was pushing myself to think about how people who think differently than me view patriotism. But I haven't given up all my criticism of the problem with patriotism because it's a slippery slope, a very short slippery slope to nationalism, right? And I'll tell you, if we're talking about today, we can see that, right? How quickly it slips into embracing a kind of fascism and a kind of superiority to other communities. John Dewey, the philosopher who wrote 100 years ago, I mean, he's very annoying because everything that you think about today,
That's right.
he wrote about 100 years ago. But he talks about what a real community is, and he says there's two characteristics of a healthy community, and one is the number and strength of bonds among community members. But the other, which is equally important, is the number of connections and strength of the bonds between your community and other communities.
Oh, nice.
And he saw those being working together.
Uh-huh. And if we want to go even earlier than Dewey, Thoreau said something like, I feel I owe my obligation to human beings and only to my own country at a later and more convenient hour. And you don't even have to talk about what's going on today to see what's horrendous about patriotism, or at least a certain version of it. We were always able to wince at, say, what passes for patriotism in Russia or China. The trick is to see that the same concept may be problematic here.
You just said something very important, which you drew from Thoreau, but that is that, to put another word to it, if the patriotism dehumanizes people outside of your group, that's a red flag that something's very, very wrong, right? Saying that we have allegiance to the human race, I think, is an important concept, that not only do we need to build community among ourselves, but we can't do that at the expense of the humanity of people around us.
And then the interesting question is whether an us and them view of the world invariably leads to us versus them. Or to put it differently, is there something within patriotism that tends to pull us predictably toward that dehumanization?
Yeah, and I think there is. I think that's the danger, and we're seeing the very evidence of that right now, right? I mean, literally, what does America first mean? And so we're seeing that, and we're seeing it slip into not just nationalism, but outright fascism.
Yep. So I want to talk finally about more of the classroom stuff in particular. And you came up with this, I think, brilliant thought experiment, which I will now attempt to paraphrase, because why should I let you offer your ideas when it's my podcast and I'll tell you what you've said? So, yeah, but correct me if I'm wrong here. The idea is, imagine you are placed magically in some classroom and you don't know where it is. What can you conclude about the government of the country you're sitting in by looking at what's happening in the classroom and how, at the pedagogy, something like that? Is that close enough?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is.
Okay. So I was frankly surprised when you kind of pushed back on the idea of certain aspects of progressive education. Well, I mean, first, maybe I should just stick with the thought experiment and ask, let me just ask you this. What in a classroom would indicate that your school was in a democratic country? How would you know?
Yeah, because I'll just preamble to that and just to elaborate a little on what you said is that, look, a lot is very similar. We know, that if you were in China or North Korea, learning that 2 + 2 = 4, or how to do fractions, or, learning a foreign language, or the life cycle of a glowworm, all these things might be similar in different systems of government. But so it raises the question of what should be different in a democracy, right? And I think what should be different is that the classroom also has to be filled with some of the things we've talked about, teaching that there are multiple perspectives, that people think differently, that we have to engage with those perspectives because you have to make decisions on that question, how should we live? And you make those decisions through democratic channels. And we also need to teach, even with the problems we've surfaced, critical thinking, in the sense that we need people to be able to interrogate the things we take for granted, right? The air that we breathe. We need to teach people that many of the things we take for granted aren't taken for granted by other people and don't have to be taken for granted. That's what I want to see in a classroom that's feeding democratic life rather than squashing it.
Maybe not taking a loyalty oath to the fatherland every morning either.
Yes, exactly. Which many democratic countries, of course, do.
Yeah, we just call it the Pledge of Allegiance. But
exactly.
It's making kids recite something that's horrifying when you think about the implications, especially for young children.
And not only do they often not know the meaning of it, they often don't know the words.
Well, that's just cute. It's this is not cute. When they do know the meaning, or whether we don't care whether they know the meaning. The point is to enact the ritual and to get them used to it. But at the beginning, when we started talking, you offered a 3-point framework where I think the third point was, which I hadn't seen in your writing before, the third point was not just education for democracy, but it was teaching democratically. All right. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about teaching democratically. You've talked about critical thinking. You've talked about community, right? All of these things are key elements of what I would call progressive pedagogy. And yet, in your book, you say that teaching for democracy and teaching democratically aren't always the same. And you argue that some progressive teaching doesn't further democratic content or objectives. And you also argue that democratic content can be taught with direct instruction. So in both directions, you're offering a critique of the idea that we ought to be teaching for democracy by teaching progressively. But so you want to say more about either of those, about all those arguments? Because they surprised me.
First of all, I don't think I do say that teaching progressively, at least using those words, because of the very reasons you said. I am critical of some of the things that that fall under the banner of progressive teaching. But for example, the reason those two aren't the same, aren't aligned completely, the teaching for democracy and teaching democratically. I mean, just think of how many people were radicalized, towards progressive ideas by sitting in a lecture in college and hearing a dynamic, engaging, and provocative professor tell people that not everything they learned is correct and that there are other ways of looking at things. So there's plenty of pedagogies that can do that. We like pedagogy that engages the students or builds on their experience or puts them in circles and has them talk to each other, for sure. But it doesn't necessarily align completely with the idea of teaching for democracy. And likewise, I don't think that every thing that falls under the big banner of progressive teaching is necessarily consistent with teaching for democracy. So, for example, and again, John Dewey was very critical of the idea that we just need to throw out everything about traditional pedagogy without having some theory of learning and teaching that can take its place. Like just rejecting everything old isn't enough. And so, for example, the idea that all kids need to learn is for teachers to get out of their way, right? That they just learn by themselves. Look, kids learn to speak by themselves, and they'll learn other things by themselves.
Well, that's not progressive education. That's not Dewey. That's not Piaget. That's a different hands-off Summerhill model. The progressives have stood against that idea. That's sort of like a false dichotomy that conservatives are always using to try to undermine progressive pedagogy, is to equate it with a laissez-faire approach.
Yeah, but I think some progressives equate those two, right? They say that progressive pedagogy, not the historical progressives like the people we're talking about, the academics, but people on the ground. In fact, Dewey left the association that he started, the Progressive Education Association, because he was concerned about the things spreading under his name, progressive schools that embraced that kind of pedagogy. I think that when we read theory and we read the academics who write about this stuff, they make that distinction, but not everyone does.
No, that's true. So that argument is basically what you're saying is teaching for democracy is not the same as letting kids do whatever they want, and given enough sunshine, the acorn grows into a tree.
But it doesn't mean that involving students, for example, in having their opinion taken seriously on what should be taught or on the curriculum, it isn't good for teaching for democracy. It's just, I mean that it's not the only way.
Although it's not the only way, it goes back to your first argument with sometimes you can be democratized. I don't want to say indoctrinated into a commitment to democracy by listening to a lecture. And I wonder if that's true, if I can sort of respectfully push back on that. Connie Camille, in talking about math education, says, and the other constructivists say, through direct instruction, you can be taught the nomenclature in mathematics, but you must actively construct mathematical concepts that you simply cannot learn by simply hearing it. And not everybody agrees with that, of course, but if you give some credence to that in intellectual concepts, I wonder if something similar might not be true of democracy and citizenship in the fullest sense that you talk about it. Whether hearing and even a stirring lecture, simply passively absorbing it, I'm not sure it's fair to argue that too can work just as well toward the democratic ends without real progressive education that involves active community and active construction of meaning. In fact, one of the essays in your collection on patriotism by Gerald Graff contained a searing objection to the idea of direct instruction, and particularly people who claim that they're teaching for social justice, quote, where democratic controversy may be advocated but not enacted or modeled.
Yeah. Well, look, some of that's obvious. You can't teach swimming by lecturing about swimming, right? You need to do it. So no one who implies that there are different ways to teach for democracy, including myself, say that you can teach everything that way. And I'll push back, Alfie. This very podcast is a form of lecturing. There is no democratic involvement of your listeners, but I assume you're wanting to accomplish something by the podcast and you want people to learn from it. And so I think there are many ways to skin the cat. And yes, I don't think never involving kids in practicing democracy is the best way, but it doesn't mean that we have to do everything with what we think of as progressive pedagogy.
I guess it depends on what the goal is. First of all, there's obviously a difference between a one-shot presentation at a conference or a podcast on the one hand and an ongoing class on the other, where my view tends to be the more time I have with these people, the less talking I should be doing. So if they're hearing me once, then they're hearing that. But I'm not hoping I can, through this and through our conversation, hope to spark some ideas and questions in listeners. But the active part, the disposition to act on this, will presumably depend on something other than listening, right?
Yeah.
And so the more we're concerned about not just having people learn civics as facts, but as a desire to participate, the more they need to be learning democracy by doing some version of democracy in the classroom itself. Or, as I love to say, kids learn good values by developing the values, by participating in the process, not by following directions, which I think you would agree with, right?
Well, I would agree with that. It's just that you don't need to throw out everything about what we consider traditional education to accomplish those goals.
Okay, well, fair enough. And what are we left with now? I mean, we're not speaking in a vacuum, and several times you've made reference to what we're focusing on, what we're facing these days. But I just, what do we do now at a time? I was going to ask you how the fact that you're binational has informed your view, and you gave already a great answer to that in talking about the War of 1812. But I guess let's close with this. What specific guidance can you give with an eye toward democratic citizenship education? With the government services and the rule of law and democracy itself, being destroyed.
Yeah. I didn't see this coming. And, I used to, both of you and I, when we spoke and speak and wrote, we used to point to these examples of times when in schools, when, multiple perspectives weren't brought up, when a kind of teaching that's damaging to democratic life wasn't brought up. But those examples are now quaint because everything we believe in has been not only dissuading teachers from teaching, but made illegal on the cause of punishment or being fired, and so. This is very, very difficult. And I don't like saying this, but I think what we learn from history is that when you have full fascism in bloom, one of the ways to push back is to take things outside of schools, outside of formal public education. So during the civil rights era, there were freedom schools where people gathered voluntarily to do some of the things we're talking about. There were, after school things. There were community drives to do these things, sometime underground. And I don't like taking away public education as a lever. And I know that under any conditions, there will still be many teachers who teach between the cracks, who, there's not generally a policeman standing in their classroom, although you have parents who might, report them. Under these conditions, we're talking about a whole different level, a whole different ball game. And that's very scary. I don't think any of us have a solution to what's going on right now. It is mind-boggling and it's scary, especially because it's not just top-down. We have an enormous percentage of the United States who support
That's right.
basically fascism. And so that's a very difficult place to be.
Wow, and it's certainly sobering to talk about trying to rescue public schooling, which is itself under assault. But you're talking about having to move outside of the schools in order to do this kind of educational work, which is, it's disturbing to hear. Debbie Meyer said, for years, she said that the teachers who do right by the most vulnerable students have always had to be rebels, meaning they've always faced, pressure, top-down pressure to do what's not right for the students. But if we're concerned about democracy and just concerned about the well-being of our kids, we have to figure out how to be rebels now at a time when compliance can be very disturbing indeed.
Yeah, and the consequences of being a rebel are very different now than they were 10 years ago.
That's right.
Or even 6 months ago.
Well, this is perfectly consistent with the philosophy of this podcast, which is always to end on a deeply depressing note. So I think that's important. But Joel, I really appreciate sharing the research and thoughts on this. The issues don't get much more timely than this. And I appreciate your work, and I appreciate you taking the time to share it with us today.
Alfie, it's always a pleasure talking with you, and this has been great. Thanks.